Hey y'all, and welcome to a special episode of Reading Rural Y'all. My first ever, but hopefully not the last, author interview. Today I have the distinct pleasure of talking about all things rural and YA literature with rural YA author and advocate Nora Shalaway Carpenter, a graduate of Vermont College of Fine Arts MFA in Writing for Children and Young Adults program. She's the author of The Edge of Anything, the editor and contributing author of the YA anthology Rural Voices, 15 Authors Challenge Assumptions About Small Town America, and the author of the picture book Yoga Frog. The links to those books will be in the description below. So if you're interested, check those out. Originally from rural West Virginia, she currently lives in Asheville, North Carolina with her husband, kids, dog, and cat. Nora and I met at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas this summit on YA literature this year and bonded over our passion for rural people, places, and cultures. And I am super excited to be talking with her today. Hey, Nora, and welcome. Thanks so much for being here.
Hey, Dr. Shay, thanks so much for having me. I'm so excited to chat.
Great. So to start us off, I'd love for us to get to know a little bit more about you. Can you tell us a little bit about your background, where you're from, and how that's impacted who you are as both a person and a writer?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am from very rural West Virginia and the northern part of West Virginia, because the state is actually three distinct sections. If you have ever lived there, that you kind of know, there's like the north, the east, and then the rest of the state, the middle and the southern. And so I'm from the northern panhandle, from a teeny tiny town. I graduated with 60 other kids, and I graduated with the people that I went to kindergarten with. There was no ingoing or outgoing schools. It was just the 60 of us, right? I think maybe like one person moved away or something like that's it. And so I'm from this small place, and I talk a lot about this in the introduction to Rural Voices too, but I definitely internalized rural outsiders, I guess, ideas of rural America and what that meant to me. And there was a lot of shame that came around that. And I first started figuring that out when I went to college at Marshall University, which is in West Virginia. And I got the Jaeger scholarship there. So woo-hoo, I have to shout it out. You guys should check it out. But I took a class on Appalachian literature, and it just floored me. I always loved to read. I always loved to write. And I always thought you had to do that in a certain way. That's kind of like what I had been taught. The particular things that I was being given to read were all pretty much of one style. And so I just wasn't aware that you could really write successfully in other ways. And this class really opened that up for me. And then I went on to do more creative writing, and eventually discovered that I wanted to write about my, not my own rural experience necessarily, but an experience of characters that was authentic to me, to what I knew about rural places, that was very different from what I was seeing portrayed in the media, and which was usually very negative, very stereotypical, hillbillies that were stupid, and it was fine to make fun of these people, and it was just really harmful to the people that I loved, and not at all representative of where I came from. And so Rural Voices was definitely born out of that place. My first novel, The Edge of Anything, is not exactly rural, although it has a lot there in a lot of rural places, because it takes place in the mountains of North Carolina. But it also definitely deals with socioeconomic issues. Like, these girls are from very different families. And because I think of where I'm from, socioeconomics are very important for me too. I'm always dealing with that in my books. My next novel there's heavy socioeconomic dynamics in that as well. And so certainly where I grew up has influenced me in that way. And also by my rural experience, my books are always filled with nature. Like, where they're set is always really important to the meaning of the story. And that has definitely come from where I grew up.
That's so interesting. The point you made about like what constitutes a rural book, what constitutes a rural story. I actually wrote a little bit about this on one of Dr. Bickmore's YA Wednesdays because it's something that I've been thinking a
Oh,
lot about too. I
nice.
read Lori Haltz Anderson's Shout,
Yep.
and there are a few poems in there that deal with like she's kind of from a rural place too, you know,
Mhm.
and she definitely has like agrarian background, and
Mhm.
I never would have guessed, you know,
Right.
like I had no idea. And so even though that book's not a rural book, like there are still rural themes in that book. And
Mhm.
some of the thinking that I've been doing in this, like, you know, in this channel, in the Reading Rural Y'all channel, has to do with like the sort of foregrounding or backgrounding of place and why authors do that in certain ways and what the effect of that is on the story that they're telling. And so I
Mhm.
think that's, to hear that come from an author, I just feel really validated and like my thinking as a reader, you
Oh,
know?
good. I'm glad. Yeah, because it's always on my mind. I mean, honestly, I mean, now I'm aware of it. When I first started writing, that's just what happened, right? It was just that like this sense of place was like seeping into all these stories, and they were always set like in these natural places, and really important scenes took place, you know, in really natural areas, in really rural places. And then I was like, okay, this is what's happening here. Like this is such a big part of my own identity, and that I'm always working it into the themes of my book.
Why did you want to start telling stories? Like, why did you start writing? How did you know you wanted to become a writer? Why did you make that decision? Those kind of things.
Okay. Um, oh man, I have always loved to tell stories. I just, my dad will tell you, like, she just never stopped talking. So I think part of it was just like, I like to talk. So I just like tell these stories and make up these. And I think honestly, I mean, my sister is 6 years younger than me. We grew up on 90 acres and it was just us. And so you know, we didn't have like screens and stuff. And so I'm just like running around in the woods, like coming up with these adventures in my head, like pretending that I'm these people that I read in books or, you know, and so just I've always just been really interested in the power that stories give you, because they they would take me away on these like wonderful adventures. And it's not that I like wanted to be away. Like sometimes I did, like, or I'd be like, oh, I'm bored. I wish I was like, you know, a pirate or something. And so as a little kid, you know, like making up these kind of stories. But also just I was fascinated with, and my mom did teach English, so she was always giving me books. And I was just fascinated by how some of these books just held such power over me. Like I was like, oh, I have to finish this book. I have to know what happens. And then after the book is over, I'm still thinking about the characters. Like, well, why am I thinking about that? Like, how did this person do that? And as a kid, and a teenager, I could not really imagine myself writing a book. I wrote some short stories, you know, and I was like, okay, I think I can do this. It's hard, but it's manageable. And I couldn't even like, even I would say even like 17, 18, I couldn't fathom that that I could write like a whole length book. Um, so yeah, I loved I loved the power that came from that, how you could just create other worlds, how you could create characters that other people could get lost in. And when I studied English literature, was one of my majors in college. And when I started kind of dissecting stories and just seeing um, what you're able to get across and how you're able to like, it started out with like, I wanted to be able to move people. I wanted people to feel a certain way. Right. And so that's why I wanted to tell stories. And then it kind of became more, I mean, I still want that, but like my agent calls me a social justice writer, because like a lot of my books always have some kind of social justice theme. And it's not like, I want to be very clear, I don't write with like an agenda, but I often have like real world issues that are conflicting, and it's like, well, what do we do about this? Like where can we go from here, kind of thing. And so I'm trying to figure out real world ideas in my books and through story. And I really think that the only way that you can change minds is to change hearts, is to change emotions. And so that part of storytelling really grabbed me in and made me want to make it my career. Like, we just are facing a number of severe problems right now, both as a nation and as a world. And the separation among people is so stark. You have, there's just like black and white ideas, and everybody just, I feel like the more and more I talk to people, people are just like stuck in like this one view of the world and like won't even entertain any other ideas. And I think that story is it's like getting to know a person, right? Like when you know someone intimately, like not through social media, or just reading their tweets, like when you actually meet a person and about what they've been through in life and their real world experiences, then you can start to have empathy for them, and you can start to see things from their point of view, and the same with them, like they can see things from your point of view. And I think that's what's so beautiful about stories, is that it allows readers to like slip into the places of the characters in the story, not always the main character too, like just everybody that's in there. So
yeah, so then how do you go about it? Like what's your writing process like? What's your writing routine like? What is your writing life like?
Yeah, that is a great question. So in non-COVID times, where let's say, so I have 3 small children. So when they are at school, I am writing basically the whole time that they're at school. I usually can write creatively for about 4 hours at a time. Some people can write like all day, and I just can't do that. I have about 4 hours of creativeness in me of generating new material, and then I can read, or I can revise other things, or I can work on a different project. But in terms of just writing, I've got about 4 hours of me in my day. And a lot of times that has to be spread out at very inopportune times. So like getting up before my kids get up, like there was a period where I was getting up at 5 a.m. for a while, and then I would write until 7. And then my kids started getting up earlier. And so I had to like find other times to write, and I would write late at night, although it's really hard for me to write late at night. I'm just exhausted. Yeah. So the hardest part about writing for me is actually first drafting, because I think a lot of writers struggle with perfectionism. And certainly like you read a finished book and you're like, wow, how did the person write that? And it's like, well, they didn't just sit down and write it. They wrote it multiple times, and they had other people talk to them about how to make it better. And so that's hard to kind of turn that part of my brain off. Especially because I do editorial work too. So I really have to like shut that off and just be like, okay, it's fine. You're just going to tell this story, and it's fine if it's a mess. It's fine if it's bad. I even have like a little sticky note on my computer that says, write bad, Nora, like, cause I know I can write bad, it's fine. And then I can just make it better in revision. So definitely the hard part for me is just getting that first draft out there. And then I love revision. I've come to love it. I didn't used to revise at all before I went to school for writing, before I actually was forced to do a lot of revision. I didn't want to do it, but now that's the superpower of writers, is revision.
Yeah. And it makes me think about, so like in my own writing teaching, I feel like there are so many things that I would do differently. And that's one of them, is to stop focusing so much on errors that students make, but accept the, sort of the badness of their first drafts, in order to, and see that as strength that we can build from through revision, and really focus on revision instead of focusing so much on drafting, which is how I was taught. And so that's how I taught in my classroom. But now that I know better, I do better in my classes now. But that's one thing that I wish I could kind of go back and change.
Oh yeah, totally. I mean, I feel that way too. Like, so we've talked about this book before, but in the book, the anti-racist writing workshop, Felicia Rose Chavez, she explains first drafts as just like the energy, like you can feel the energy, and that's what you want. You want the students to put their energy out there, because when someone's excited about something, you can feel it as a reader. And I can feel that even in books, even I think it translates all the way into the published stage, where if you're like, okay, someone like probably was trying really hard to hit a deadline on this book, and it's, you know, it's solid, it's fine. But then you've got this other book over here and you're like, wow, this person was like passionate about this and it comes through. And so it is then tricky, like, how do you grade something, you know, like what are you grading on it? And you have to figure that out. But first drafts, I think what I didn't learn for a long time was that there's a lot of failure that is necessary to be a good writer, not just in getting, you know, rejections and things like that from publication, which is what people usually think about, but in terms of like the actual writing itself. Like, you know, my very first young adult novel that I ever attempted, I think when I got to like page 100, I realized that I wasn't going to use the first 50 pages, right? That it just didn't fit the story anymore. And I think if I'd known that up front, I would have been like, no, you know, like it would have been so devastating. But then once I got to that 100, I was like, oh, okay, I see. Like now I've written my way into the story and I can get rid of that. But I wouldn't have found my way if I hadn't written those 50 pages. I had to write that to get where I needed to be. And so that's a lesson that I'm constantly learning myself. And so I talk about it all the time, hoping that I will just kind of like keep it in my head, because it's so important. Like, you know, you won't write the scene the way it needs to be unless you write it the 3 ways that it doesn't work, you know, and you have to, and that can be really frustrating for professional writers as well, obviously, as for student writers or someone just learning about the craft. But it's really important. I feel like I wasn't taught that until I was in a master's program. And it's so important to know that you write and you write and you write to be a writer. That's what writing, or that's what being a writer is. It means writing. And a lot of that stuff is never going to see the light of day, but all of it helps make you a better writer, and also your work just better and stronger, because you're always learning lessons, even from written works that you're not using, that end up, you know, just going in the trash. I remember being so resistant to like some of the like things my writing teachers would make me do, because I was like, I just want to write this story. I don't want to have to go back and write this scene that's not even going to be in the book, you know. But then it always taught me something, right? Like writing that scene gave me all this other information that I could then trickle out through the book, and that helped me make the plot tighter, or helped me make the characters' growth more apparent. And so I think there's probably going to be a lot of resistance from, it's sad, but I feel like a lot of kids grow up thinking that writing is so like hard. Mm-hmm. And on the one hand, it is, as a discipline, as a craft, just like any profession is, to do something well. On the other hand, writing fiction is storytelling, and storytelling is hardwired into our brains, literally. Like that's how humans have always communicated and always understood themselves and the world, is by telling stories. And most students don't realize that they're doing that every day when they're coming into school and talking to their peers and telling stories of what happened over the weekend. And so it's, how can we translate that kind of storytelling and that passion for storytelling, or even that passion for, like, you know, binging a Netflix show, which is a story and it is a visual media, but it's nonetheless a story. It's all related. And so, like, you know, kind of tapping into that. Okay, so what did you love about that show so much that made you watch it, you know, 8 episodes in a row, and like that you held on to it? And like, how can we translate that into a story that you write, you know, getting that same kind of passion? So I think it's like very, like, there's like a mind shift that I think needs to happen in terms of how we teach creative writing. That I'm just kind of figuring out, because I'm still like working on my own process.
And you always will be, you know, like, yeah. It's not like you will ever arrive at like, now I am a fully formed author and this is how I will always be.
You know? I know, it's both comforting and very disconcerting to know that, because like I'll hear like really famous, well-known, or, you know, prolific authors who have written 15 books or 20 books, and they're saying that, like, oh, every book, it's like I have to learn how to write all over again. And I'm like, oh no, you know, because um and it's also helpful at the same time, like when you're in the trenches and you're like, oh, I don't like, I was just saying to my husband the other day, like working on my novel in progress, and I was like, oh, this is really bad. Like I sent him a text, I was like, this is just bad, and he's like, oh, I've heard this before, it's like this cycle, and he like knows now, and he's like, oh, this is just the part where you doubt everything before you go back and do the big revision. And I'm like, oh yeah, it's true, I guess. But it's totally frustrating.
But I think having that understanding and awareness of like what your process is like, and that it is part of your process, is also really helpful. I think, even I don't think we ask high school students to think about their writing process. I don't think we think that they have one. I don't,
Yeah.
and so, and that's really frustrating to me. but yeah, so I think, having that awareness and that understanding of like, this happens every time and it's uncomfortable and it's going to continue to be uncomfortable, and I'm just going to sit in it because it's going to help me do what I need to do, like,
yeah, it's like therapy. You're like, let's sit in our discomfort here.
right, because it's only going to last for a little while, and
Yeah.
and then we'll move on and it'll be fine.
Yeah, some authors that are much more organized than me will actually like journal through their books. And so they can go back and then look and be like, oh yes, it was at chapter 12 that I also had this feeling of despair, and so they can be like, and then read on and, oh, okay, it came around, it got better. So I think that would be really interesting for students too, not just for creative projects, but also for like research projects, because it's the same kind of cyclical thing. And I think too, it's hard with the revision process. I remember being a student and just wanting to like get things done. Like, I just want to get it done and get it off my plate. And I don't want to have to deal with all this extra stuff. And so I think teaching students to slow down, and the act of writing is a process. Like there is a product at the end, but the more important thing is to learn how to do this process so that you're able to then have a much better product. And that's a hard lesson to swallow for anyone.
Especially because we don't really, we're like, okay, and now revise. But like most teachers conflate revision and editing. And so again, like, giving writers the tools that will help them sort of better understand their process. I think that's what sort of like lifts the veil and will like help them understand that writing is hard, like you said, just because it is like anything else, but also that everyone's a writer if you write, and you can continue to fine tune and hone your craft,
and that you don't have to sound the same. So I think this is a really important thing, because some people will even they'll even like teach exercises where it's like, okay, let's read this passage by Charles Dickens, and then we're going to write in a similar style. And so I will say that there are times when that kind of an exercise can be beneficial, but for someone like Charles Dickens, I mean, that would be for a way advanced class that would have known more than just old English writers. Well, not old English, but English writers from
historical
several hundred years ago. Yes. And there's so many, like, we don't talk like that anymore. Like, we're often giving students these texts by old white men, even from like the 40s and 50s, the 20s, like, and so we're getting like one lens, one perspective, and students are internalizing, okay, this is what literature is. This is what good literature is. And it's just the canon of Western literature. It's not anything else. And if you don't have that voice, because for whatever reason, you don't resonate with that voice because you're not white,
from 1800s Britain,
right? Or you're not from Britain, or you're not from, you're not a man, like you're not, like, there's just all of these things that most of the students today aren't going to resonate with those kinds of things. And so it's like, well, then what is writing? Like, if writing is that, I don't want to do it. It's that's not me. But like, what if writing is new and fresh, and not just Western, but all of these different styles of communicating are being shown as writing, and an expression that is not only accepted, but is like praised and highly valued. And then I think that's where we can hook students, where we can be like, oh yeah, I really don't like reading F. Scott Fitzgerald, but I love reading this book that just came out in 2021, like, so I think too, and that's hard for, depending on your school system, like certain books have to be taught and there's a whole nother battle in there. But I think remembering that most of our students aren't going to identify with a lot of the canon.
Yeah, I taught Kate Chopin's The Awakening.
Yep.
To sophomores in Pinedo, Indiana. in like 2010. And I didn't ask them to write like that. We did a multi-genre project after they were finished reading where there was writing involved, where they were like, changing the ending or, writing letters between characters or whatever, but they could write however they wanted to write them. But, I think even though that's a story masterfully told,
right,
and you can look at the components and like what she did in order to make it that way, you can still take that sort of technique and way of storytelling and not use the same type of English.
Yeah, exactly. Totally. And I do think that, pairing that story alongside with a more modern example would be helpful too, just to compare, just to show that there's not one way, or if you're looking specifically at a certain element of storytelling, like how does it work in multiple different short pieces. But it's so funny that you said that about The Awakening, because my mom, the English teacher, loves The Awakening. And I told her one day that I really didn't like it. And she was like, oh, what? Because I also, read it in high school. And I was like, I just hate that she just kills herself. She just goes into the ocean. She leaves everything. And she's like, well, you're not thinking about all these, she's like going through it. And I'm like, but I'm thinking about it how I read it as like a teenage kid in, the early, let's see, when was late 90s or whatever, like it just and it was just like it just didn't compute with me for whatever reason. And I've always like been really mad about it. And like, I've had to study that story a lot as an English lit major. And so like, I totally, it is a beautiful, masterfully done story. And yet for me as a reader, it really bugs me. And I think that in itself is okay. Like to show students that like, you don't have to necessarily like how a story is for it to be a good story. And that's why these can be, like showing as much array as possible and just talking about, well, what does make a good story and how, how subjective that is and where does the subjective meet the objective and that kind of stuff. There's lots of interesting conversations that you can have there. But I do think that like if a kid is like, well, I just don't, I read, we read The Hobbit and I just didn't really like it, one kid and like, that's okay. Like, you don't have to like this story. Lots of people love it, but that doesn't mean you have to like it. That doesn't mean you're not a reader or that you can't be a writer just because you don't connect to something that a lot of people enjoy.
Yeah, I think sort of distancing ourselves from that sort of evaluative type of language and not talking about like good stories, but talking about effective stories. And talk about what writers do that make them effective, even if you don't necessarily enjoy them. Like there still should be joy and pleasure in reading. There should be that, and students should have the opportunity to read for enjoyment and for pleasure. But when it comes to learning about writing and being an effective writer, whether it's in a creative genre or in like, because research reporting is still storytelling, right. It's just a different kind. And so, thinking about like what makes certain things effective, I think is more helpful than saying, was this good?
Absolutely. And I still remember that story, like, it definitely impacted me in a way that many, many other stories that I don't remember did not. So, yeah, there's a lot of stuff. I love that though, about being effective. And I do think we have to think about audience too, right? Because especially like, before we started recording, we were talking about like the the urban schools, right? Where you've got the rural and the urban kids coming together. And so what kind of audience are you writing for? Because if you're a person of color writing for a rural person of color, what you write, what you leave out and what you say and what you put in is going to be different than if you're a white urbanite writing for a white urbanite audience, or if you're queer, right, urbanite writing for, like there's all these different factors. And do we have, sometimes I think we try to teach kids to write towards like a general audience. And I'm not sure that is, this is coming from Craft in the Real World, by the way, that book. And I'm not sure if that's doing them a favor. I don't think it is, because if we were letting kids, like one kid be like, well, I didn't resonate with it. Well, it's okay, you didn't, but like, maybe you're not the audience, maybe this kid was writing for this audience over here. And if they read it, it would resonate with them. And what does that mean? And do you, as the author, are you okay with it not resonating with this audience? Or do you want to change it in a way that can make it resonate with both? Or if you don't, if you're writing for a specific audience, what is going behind that choice? So just as long as asking questions that make writers aware of the power that they hold, of the decisions that they're making, why are they choosing to leave in certain details or remove certain details? Is it because you live a life that your peers know so little of that you have to explain every little thing, that if you were showing your parents at home, you would never have to explain all those details? So being conscious, or at least having discussions about what is audience, who makes the audience, who is criticizing things, like that can just help bring a sense of, I think, validation to stories that aren't commonly told. Like when I was putting together Rural Voices, like that was the whole thing. Nobody is talking about authentic rural stories. Like there's like this one stereotypical idea of a rural person, and it's usually some version of like a white hillbilly with straw in his teeth, or no teeth missing, and this deep accent and no shoes and overalls. I mean, just like this ridiculous picture that those of us from like real rural America are like, oh my gosh, it's like ridiculous. But that like a lot of people actually think of when you say the word rural, and still now in 2021. And so that's why I was like, listen, we need to write stories that are for the rural audience, but also can be read by the non-rural audience to be like, oh, look, there are these other things that are happening, but I think you always have to consider audience too when you're writing. And it's not that you want to write toward a specific audience. You just want to know, like, who is it that will read your stuff, and why are you writing it in the way that you are, if that makes sense.
Yeah, like what writing moves do you need to make in order to make your writing effective for who you want to read it, and who you want to understand it. Yeah. And I think, you're talking about windows and mirrors and sliding glass doors, and and that's one of the reasons why I was so excited about Rural Voices, because I can't think of a single contemporary rural book that I read when I was in high school, and I didn't teach one either. Yeah. And now when I think about my syllabi for the adolescent literacy courses that I teach, I look back at them and I'm like, man, there's not a single contemporary rural book on there, and so representation is huge. And so that's one of the many things that I appreciate about your work. And I feel like this is a perfect segue into you talking a little bit more about your projects. Whatever you want to talk to us about, past projects, things you're proud of, what do you have in the works? What can we be looking forward to? That kind of stuff.
Yeah, so I have a number of things in the works. Some of them I can talk about, some of them I can't yet, but the ones that I can talk about. So I really loved doing this anthology. Like I had so much fun working with these incredible writers and putting it together that I decided to do another anthology, and it is and it's coming out with Candlewick too, the same publisher. And it's not coming out until 2023 because that's how long the lead time is with books, but it's called Absolutely Normal. And I'm co-editing it with Rocky Cowan, who is another YA author, my very good friend. And it is just how this focuses on rural voices. This Absolutely Normal focuses, all the stories are about characters that have some kind of mental health condition or challenge. And the stories, very importantly, are not about that particular challenge, but they simply have a main character that deals with it every day. And so it is just to show, it's to normalize mental health, because it is just a real crisis in all over the world, basically, and even more so with COVID-19, and for a long time has been stereotyped and maligned, and just especially in certain populations. I mean, in rural America, or at least where I grew up, it was like a very taboo. You couldn't talk, you needed to lift yourself up by your bootstraps, and if you couldn't do that, well, that was shameful, and so Rocky and I have gathered just an incredible group of writers that are like, no. And so all of the writers actually suffer from the same condition as their protagonists, which is really cool, because I wanted the rep to be super authentic. And I also wanted kids to see that, just like the protagonists in these stories, like, you can have a wonderful life and suffer from bipolarism. You can have a great successful career. Like, you can be, a really respected writer, and you can be suicidal, or be suffering with depression or with OCD or with an eating disorder. I mean, we have, this is a select group of 15 stories, and there's way more conditions than that out there, but just, it's a pretty diverse list, both in terms of the writers themselves and the mental health conditions that they are writing about. And I love it so much. Like, the stories, about half of the stories have already come in, and like, we're actively editing, actually probably more than that. So we just got another one in, and they're just so good. Like they just blow my mind. Like, these people are, these writers are just incredible. And I'm so hopeful that so many young people will see themselves in these stories, or will see their friend, or their mom or their dad, or their brother, and just have more empathy for people that are going through, and kind of, because a lot of times, especially with things like OCD, that can be hijacked as like a way to make a character like quirky, or funny, or look at these funny things that we do. And for a person who's living that reality, that's not funny, we're totally fine, like, giving medicine for heart conditions, but if you have something that impacts your brain for some reason, that's not okay in a lot of populations. And so really challenging that is what this whole collection is about. And so I'm super, super excited about that. And then the same year, I have another novel coming out that I can talk about a little bit. And it's actually set in rural West Virginia. And I'm so, so excited about it. It's dual perspective, just like my first one, but with a heavy dose of socioeconomic and environmental ethics stuff going on, and some romance, and some challenges to gender dynamics. Like, there's just a lot going on with these two characters in this very rural setting, and it's super close to my heart. So that's coming out by Running Press Teen, under Hachette. So that will also be out 2023. And that's all I can tell you about right now.
Well, I love the mystery and suspense. My last question that I had for you today was what advice you have for young people and or teachers, especially those who live in rural places, who want to pursue writing as a career?
Yes. So my advice is twofold. The first is that you should read just as much as you can and not just like the standard, English canon. Like read all different poetry, slam poetry, watch those performances, like find what you really love and read it. If you love, you know, campy science fiction, read that. Read other stuff too, but maybe you want to write that kind of stuff. Like, that's okay. If you love romantic comedies, read those. Anything that like just makes you feel like so immersed, like oh, I have to read this, I have to be inside of it. That is the stuff. That's what I say, like that's how you know what you're supposed to write. And you might end up writing all different genres throughout your career, but probably you want to start with the stuff that you love to read. So read widely to find like just the genre that you want to start writing in. And then also read craft books. You can get bogged down with craft books because there's like a million gazillion of them. So look at the ones that are constantly recommended. I tell everyone to read Storycraft. Is that Story Genius. Story Genius. I always tell people to start with that one because it's awesome. And also I feel truly that if you want to be a writer and you want to have something published, that you can do it, but there is no time limit on that. And so the biggest thing you can have is persistence. Like if you just give up after a couple times because it's hard, I mean, just like anything that you give up with, it's going to be really hard to excel at. But if you keep going and you keep reading and you keep working on your craft and you keep trying, I truly believe that anyone can publish.
How does a person go about like let's say I've finished something and I want to try to get it to publishers, or I want to try to get it to someone who might be able to publish me. Like, how does that work? Because I feel like that's one aspect of the process that no one ever talks about. And so
they don't even talk about that at MFA programs very often. So okay, so it really depends on what you're writing. So if you're writing short stories, then if you're writing short stories, you should be reading short stories. So you should be very familiar with the market and what literary magazines are publishing. You're probably not going to jump straight to like the New Yorker. I mean, maybe, but I would submit at other places too. And so doing your research, and that's pretty simple to do online, about what magazines and what e-magazines are publishing short stories. If you have a novel, you're probably going to have to get an agent, and then that's going to depend on what type of novel it is. Is it a genre novel? Do you write specifically for teenagers? So you'd be considered a young adult author, so you're going to want an agent that represents young adult literature. Or are you writing adult, like say murder mysteries? That's a very different type of book, and so you'd want to find an agent that represents adult murder mysteries. And again, this is just doing your homework, and agent hunting can take like 6 months if you start and you know nothing. I mean, because you don't want to sign with any old agent. You want to sign with somebody that loves your work and that will represent you for your entire career. So, and this is again not for short stories, this is for books, like novels. So most people are going to start with short stories unless you're taking, I would also say, take creative writing classes, take workshops, like do them virtually online. Like those things are going to teach you so much. They're going to save you so much time in the long term. And they're also going to build connections. Like you'll meet other writers that way that you can share ideas with, that you can bounce off. Maybe you'll have a professor that you really resonate with that will help you out, that could be like, oh, I think your work would be great for this magazine that I know, like maybe you should submit to them. So really putting yourself out there when it's safe to do so. I mean, people are going out now, like but go to events at your local bookstore. They always have like author readings. That sometimes they'll have workshop events. Those are the places that you can meet the type of people that are like you and like form groups, and then also join the society for whatever kind of writing. Like if you're a science fiction writer, join the science fiction and is it fantasy group? There's a specific group, like join that group because they share resources, and you can, if you're a young adult writer, you know, you can look into SCBWI, which is going through some challenges right now, but it does have some good information there. If you're a romance writer, there's the Romance Writers of America, you know, and those places are going to have specific like how to get started, and that's the easiest. That, and then just talking to other people that have done it, that are doing it, that are in the process. And so it is a lot of like, you have to put yourself out there, you know. Nobody's like, you could write like the greatest thing in the world, and if you don't do anything about it, it'll just sit on your desk or on your desktop, you know. No one's just going to come randomly and be like, hello, excuse me, do you have any writing that we can publish? Like, it just doesn't work like that. You have to like really be putting yourself out there all the time and looking for places to submit. And, you know, you're going to get rejected. I mean, you could have a story that ends up being like wildly successful that Netflix purchases one day, you know, and you'll probably get rejections for that story from some places because it won't fit certain places where it might fit another one. And you just have to like accept that. It can be really frustrating, but just knowing that going into it, I think can be helpful too.
Thank you for all of that. You know, I think it's never like the people don't talk about that. I've even read so many writers who write about writing, but nobody ever talks about that side of it. Like a lot of people talk about craft, a lot of people talk about, you know, that kind of stuff, but you know, like Annie Dillard's not out there writing about querying, you know, like, you know what I mean? So I just think like, you know, writers who I think as a kid, like as a student, a secondary student, having an idea of what that can look like would have helped me believe that I could do it. Yes. Because like we've talked about before, I truly believed that no hayseed like me was ever going to be a published author because I came from a tiny town and I just felt like I didn't have any stories to tell. And my family we come from an oral storytelling tradition. Like, you know, like that's what we do around campfires. Like we tell each other stories.
There's nobody there being like, here's how to do this. Here's how to be a writer. Here's how to do this story stuff. You know, it's like a door that's, I think, can feel closed and locked and bolted to so many people because it's so hard to just even figure out. Like I'll get questions all the time from readers about like asking me like, how much did I pay my publisher to publish me? And it's like, oh, no, that's not how publishing works. You know, like that's self-publishing and it's not the same. But there is a great website called Query Shark, so that if you are ready to send out a query to, basically a query is just like a one-page letter of here's my book and here's why you should be my agent. And that website is awesome. It just has so many examples. She takes real queries and like puts them on there and dissects them and says how to make them better. And then she'll also have queries that have gone on to sell novels. And there's a number of query. People talk about queries at conferences a lot. Like I have a query, like how to write a query spiel that I do at conferences. Like you can find it if you're hooked into the right organizations. But again, like even knowing, like I had to have someone tell me when I was first getting into writing, like, oh, you write young adult, you should be going to SCBWI conferences. I didn't even know what that was, you know, Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators. Like, and I mean, okay. And I learned a lot. Like I learned a lot. And, but you have to have somebody that's telling you. And so, yeah. So hopefully if there's students or teachers watching this, they can find their way to the right places.
And if they're rural students and teachers, to know that rural stories are worth reading and worth studying.
And wanted now. I mean, in a way that quite frankly, is shocking to me. Like, I was a little bit worried that this collection would come out and no one would care, and we did have, like, we had great editorial response when we first, my agent first sent it out. But we also had people that were like, I like this idea a lot, but I don't think anyone will read this. And that's like, that was hard to hear, because it's exactly why we wanted the book in the world, because people need to read it, because people have this one idea of rurality, and it's just not correct in many cases. So
right. And that those people who said, I don't know if anybody is going, like, despite that those people exist, and say things like, I don't know that anybody's going to read this, rural stories are worth telling.
yes.
And no matter how imperfect they are, rural cultures are worth sustaining.
Absolutely. And we didn't get to talk about this, but we talked about it before. And so if you are writing about your own culture, about your rural culture, like, you feel free to write like your dialect, like, we need to teach that that's okay, and that there are great stories. Like, one of the stories that I fell in love with in college was Lee Smith's Fair and Tender Ladies. Do you know that one?
No.
Oh, it's so good. I love it so much, but it has heavy dialect. And so my friend that graduated from the same high school as me, she like didn't like it because of the dialect in it. But for me, I loved it. So it's just, that's going to resonate with some people and not with others. Who cares? Like, if that's your voice, if that's your style, then that's how you should be writing, especially first drafts. You shouldn't be worrying about grammar or sentence structure. I mean, yeah, if you're going to publish, then later that stuff will have to be taken care of. But getting the heart of your story out is really what matters. And if you have a character who consistently uses incorrect, grammatically incorrect phrases, well, that's okay, because that's part of their characterization,
Well, and that's how people talk. Like, there
Exactly.
are people in the world who exist, who matter, who talk like that. And
Yes.
And it doesn't mean that they're dumb. It doesn't mean that they're any less intelligent. It just means that that's how they were socialized to talk. And
Exactly.
so, like, that's fine.
And it can be really interesting to see how a character might code switch too in a certain, like, taken out of their rural setting. Like, do they change their behavior if they're in a group of people who maybe like look down on their rural setting? Like, do they, because that happens in real life too. Like, I certainly did it. My husband does it, like, and so that in itself is a really interesting story. And so, yeah, I hope that rural kids write more stories. I hope that they know that they matter in a way that I didn't feel like we mattered growing up, but now I really, really believe and know that we do. And I just think that if you want to write a story, just do it. Just try, and don't worry about being correct, because there is no such thing as a correct story. You go to get your master's in creative writing, you'll be like, how do I write a correct story? And people will say, I don't know, because that doesn't exist. Like, there are effective stories, like you were saying, and you can be taught how to create effective stories, but you have to want to tell them, and you have to believe in those stories. And so I really, really hope that rural kids do believe in their stories, because they matter.
Well, on that beautiful note, we will say goodbye. Thank you for being with us.
Absolutely.
Nora.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you, viewers, for being with us and for engaging with the ideas in this interview. And we hope to see you next time for hopefully another author interview. And if not, hope to see you for the regular videos that drop about rural books on Reading Rural, y'all. Thanks so much. Y'all come back now, would you?